Welcome to the latest session in the Learning, Equity, and Power, or LEAP series, presented by the Center for the Study of Social Policy. My name is Anand Sharma, and I'm a Senior Associate at CSSP, and I'll be your host for this session. Before we jump into conversation with our guests, I wanted to share a bit about CSSP and the LEAP initiative. CSSP works to achieve a racially, economically, and socially just society in which all children and families thrive. To do this, we promote policies grounded in equity, support strong communities, and advocate with and for children and families marginalized by public policies and institutional practices. We seek to transform ideas into action, and LEAP, Learning, Equity, and Power, is a new initiative to help us do just that. During the session and throughout the series, we'll be highlighting and encouraging learning about what it takes to advance equity and build power in communities. And we hope that you'll join us, contribute your expertise and experience, and think about how these lessons might help you more powerfully advance equity in your community. Given CSSP's longstanding commitment to supporting community policy and systems change, we couldn't be more excited to continue our LEAP series with today's session. A new health equity dialogue, lessons from the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities initiative. CSSP has had the pleasure and the privilege of being one of TCE's learning partners over the past few years. And we are beyond excited to share some of the insights, just a few, that we and other learning and evaluation partners have discovered alongside TCE and its many, many partners working across California. In this session, we'll hear about the relationship between health equity, power building, and democracy. And we are very fortunate to be joined by two amazing guests. The first we'll speak with Dr. Anthony Iton, Senior Vice President, Programs and Partnerships with the California Endowment, who will offer some reflections on the past 10 years of building healthy communities. And we're also grateful for Cathy, President and CEO of the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, who will offer some reflections from her own work to support community power and some reactions to the lessons that have come from the work of TCE. And without further ado, I'd like to formally introduce our first guest, Tony from the California Endowment. Tony, welcome to the LEAP Pad. How are you?
Great. How you doing, Anon?
I'm doing well and just so grateful for you making the time. And just wanted to start out in this conversation about this new dialogue around health equity by asking you a bit of a personal question. How did you come to philanthropy? And can you share a little bit with folks about how that experience shaped how you and the California Endowment are thinking about health equity?
Yeah, it turns out I actually tell this story not infrequently because I think it's the journey towards health equity is in some ways it's a personal journey that becomes an institutional journey. I went to medical school some 30 years ago, and my intent when I was applying to medical school was to become a neurosurgeon. I had studied neuroscience and I was just fascinated with the brain. And, I got to Baltimore, Maryland, which is where my medical school, Johns Hopkins, was located. And I was coming from Montreal, Canada. And I was sort of dropped into an environment that I couldn't understand. Baltimore, East Baltimore, where the medical school is located, and this was in the middle of the 1980s during, the crack cocaine epidemic, during the HIV epidemic. There was sort of this surge of military-style policing with helicopters and SWAT teams, and the environment immediately adjacent to the hospital was a slum. One of the most notorious slums, if you will, in the United States. And I was being toured around by an upperclassman, and he saw this look of shock on my face. This kid from Canada. And he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I managed to stammer out something to the effect of, "When was there a war here?" I couldn't understand the conditions that I was seeing. And as I sort of started medical school, I would see patients from the community. And it struck me that we were being asked to do something that was, to my mind, absurd, which was to treat what were clearly social ills with pills. And I couldn't quite grasp, what my role was in that setting. And as a consequence, I spent some time studying apartheid in South Africa. I went and worked on Capitol Hill with Ted Kennedy, and I learned about policy because in my mind, somehow the solution was universal health care, that would solve this problem. and over time, my sort of understanding of the nature of the challenges that were being faced in the United States broadened beyond just a sort of a medical model approach. And I started to recognize that there was an opportunity to look at essentially the sort of differences, the imbalances of power that were kind of baked into how we make policy and law in the United States. And a lot of it was layered on top of this history of American apartheid, which essentially consigned people to environments that were completely devoid of all the resources that they needed to live healthy lives. So that was really my first, kind of exposure to sort of the structural issues in society. And it took me a while to sort of piece it all together, but I feel like that experience, and many of my colleagues have had similar experiences in different settings, that experience has sort of led us to take a kind of a structural approach to addressing health.
That's really helpful, Tony. Appreciate you sharing a little bit about your own journey and early experiences as a doctor, and wanted to ask you, for folks that aren't familiar with the work of building healthy communities that TCE has been engaged in over the past 10 years, could you give just a quick sketch of some of the core components and how that builds upon that kind of different way of thinking about the root causes and the issues that underlie the health disparities that you all are concerned with?
Yeah, so I often describe the job that I have, that I was offered 12 years ago, and it really was at a time when people were trying to grapple with the reality that when you look at health status across a place, across a county, or across a community, and then you drill down into neighborhoods, you see these dramatic differences across neighborhoods, some of them contiguous neighborhoods. You can see things like life expectancy differences of 20, 25, 30 years across the same city. And trying to understand what drives those things was really kind of the question that public health was trying to unravel. And the paradigms that we had traditionally used were medical model paradigms. They talked about people's behavior, whether they smoke, they drink, they drive without a seatbelt, they have sex without condoms. We talked about access to healthcare, which is really kind of a transactional sort of paradigm that the more services and the better drugs and the better doctors you had, you would be healthier. And the third was sort of a genetic paradigm, that it was some sort of weird lottery where people who had bad genes, basically you had to throw medical services at them, and those with good genes lived long, healthy lives. And we recognized none of that explained what we were seeing at the sort of the local level, where you see these dramatic differences across neighborhoods of up to 30 years of life expectancy difference in the same city. And so we recognized that in order to try to undo some of this, we would have to sort of tackle the fundamentals, which to our mind were imbalances in power, because those power imbalances explained the differences in health outcomes across these places. And so our sense was, if we could build social, political, and economic power in a critical mass of people in these communities, so that they could hold systems accountable for more equitable allocation of those health protective resources, and as we discovered in our work, they could help change the narrative about who they are, who we all are, and create a sense of belonging. Our hypothesis was that we could actually, over time, create opportunity conditions that were much more conducive to better health status. So that's what we did with 14 communities. My boss, Bob Ross, who you mentioned earlier, basically said, Tony, I'm just going to give you a blank sheet of paper and write up a plan for doing this. And it was the most exciting job offer I've ever gotten. The one caveat, he said, is that you can't spend a nickel on healthcare. So this has to be a purely social determinants of health strategy. And so that's what we came up with.
I really appreciate you laying out the thinking behind building healthy communities, Tony, and want to bring Cathy into the conversation in just a moment, but appreciate you, Tony, talking about the importance of narrative change and thinking about power building, because, as we've spoken about before, it's not that folks weren't investing in those things, that philanthropy wasn't investing in it, but this is a much broader view that you all have taken about the concerns of a health-focused foundation, and also just thinking about the departure from a lot of previous place-based or community initiatives that were so focused on programs and services. So thank you for setting out
I should
that concept.
say, Anand, just quickly, that I think what we decided to do was not that radical, but it was very radical for health. And so that was what was different, that, there had been environmental justice movements, Cathy's organization and others had funded these efforts, and they understood that power and narrative were critical parts of the work. But in health, it had really been kind of a technocratic approach, which was about services and sort of optimizing sort of the medical model in low-income communities or places that were experiencing disparities. And what we recognized was that this was really a democratic problem, not a technocratic problem. And so we needed to bring democratic strategies to enhancing health. And I think that has been the sort of the big secret that has been unveiled, which is that good democracy is good for your health.
And this was an unplanned plug for a recent essay that Tony actually just completed for CSSP, talking about thinking differently and moving from technocratic to democratic solutions. So appreciate that, and providing a wonderful segue to our second guest, Cathy Cha, the President and CEO of the Haas Junior Fund. Cathy, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for having me this morning, Anand.
Oh, it is absolutely our pleasure. And as we're talking about looking back on just some of the lessons and reflections of the work that the California Endowment has done, we were so excited that you were willing to join us, because if folks don't know, the Haas Junior Fund has a strong interest and engagement and investment in areas like immigrant rights and strengthening democracy. And I was wondering, for folks that may not know your organization and its interests very well, could you share a little bit about some of the roles that you played in supporting community power and power building?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Evelyn and Walter Haas Junior Fund, we are a family foundation. It stems from the Levi Strauss Company based here in San Francisco. And we've been around for nearly 70 years, and we've tried a lot of different approaches to lift up communities and families and improve the lives of individuals. And we work hard to advance equality and justice so every person has opportunities to thrive and live life with dignity and hope. And just like the California Endowment and what Tony was talking about, we try to tackle the fundamentals. And so we focus a lot on grassroots organizing, voting, power building in immigrant communities, LGBT communities. And we have two new areas that we've been going deep on, which is kind of the structural challenges of our democracy, which I think for all of us today, I don't need to tell you how important that is. And then also, we've been tackling college affordability. And the reason for that is too many Californians and people across the country who have the motivation and the desire to go to college, but if it's the money that's holding them back, something is wrong. And so we're wondering about activating that population to change the equation for affordability and success. So those are a couple of examples of work that we do.
Thank you, Cathy. And as you've been digging into some of the lessons that have come out of the work of building healthy communities and TCE's engagement over the past 10 years, and hearing some of Tony's reflections, what are some of the lessons and learnings that most resonate with you in your experience at Haas Junior?
Yeah, I appreciate that intro because as I was listening to Tony, I realized, we've been really working alongside the California Endowment's Building Healthy Communities initiative. And we often partner because we have the same vision for the kind of world that we want for these communities that we care about. And so, in a lot of ways, we've been also trying different ways to improve the lives of low income Californians. And one of the things I wanted to share was, we didn't come to power building first. It was after years of trying different things to improve the situation for low-income Californians. And about 10 years ago, when I used to run the immigrant rights program here at Haas Junior, a community leader said something to me that has really stayed with me all these years. She said, quote, "There's no shortage of good ideas. We lack the power to get them over the finish line." Meaning, we have so many well-researched policy reforms out there, but they don't have the votes or the influence to make them real. And that's a lot like we're seeing in DC right now with the mega bills, right? No shortage of good ideas. We lack the power to get them over the finish line. So that has really stayed with me and influenced our work. And so for years, we have wanted immigrants to realize their full potential in this country and be part of the economic and social fabric of our communities. So we set off to build the strength of the California immigrant rights movement with community leaders. With that phrase, it's not we don't have the power to get it over the finish line. In my head, we really worked in partnership with community leaders across the state. And I want to tell you, we've always had some very strong immigrant rights nonprofits in California. So there's a great pool of partners to draw from. But there were gaps. 10 years ago, we didn't have much advocacy strength beyond the Bay Area and LA. Groups didn't have strong strategic communications and narrative building muscles. And civic engagement and getting out the vote was new to many of the groups. And back then, California's policy context was a lot more like Arizona, trying to shut out immigrants from public benefits, creating difficult lives for undocumented immigrants and their families. And so today, we can proudly say that California is the most pro-immigrant and welcoming state in the country. And it's really been because of the strength of the immigrant rights movement here. And so we didn't ever start with that level of power or impact, right? So the origin story of the latest chapter of immigrant rights work in California is much more modest, and it says a lot about what funders can do. So first of all, at Haas Junior, it was a disciplined and learned behavior to not lead with our own issues and our priorities. Instead, we looked for organic places where communities were coming together. And this meant we had to let go a bit and see what was bubbling up. And the first thing folks wanted to work on was nothing I could have ever guessed sitting in my office. What was riling them up was DUI checkpoints. So 10 years ago, DUI checkpoints were popping up all over the state, but not in downtown areas with bars at night. Instead, these checkpoints were showing up on a Sunday morning in Latina communities an hour before Mass started all across the state. And it turns out these DUI checkpoints were a pretense for checking papers and immigration status. It did not have anything to do with driving after drinking. And it was really the beginning of some very, very difficult immigration and police collaboration that was leading to dragnets to try and deport more undocumented immigrants. So we began investing by working with a group of leaders to try to learn more about what was going on. And so with a group of leaders, we shaped a research piece that UC Berkeley Law School actually did, and brought these groups together to develop a survey and to conduct a survey to find out what was happening with these checkpoints. Then we supported strategic communications efforts, and the group started thinking about shaping a narrative that personalized this issue, helped make the issue come home, and also let the injustice really shine through for what it was. And so they lifted up the real story of an immigrant family coming home from the hospital with their new baby. And what should have been a joyous time ended up tragic. So the family got pulled over at one of these DUI checkpoints. And the mother who had just had a C-section, the dad, their newborn, and their toddler got their car impounded and were literally thrown out of their car and stuck on the side of a road. And so the advocates did a great job working together for the first time in that coordinated statewide way to get that story blasted out all throughout the state. And it worked. It hit a chord. It hit a chord with the general public, and it hit a chord with lawmakers. And so the first policy win was not earth shattering. When you get pulled over for a DUI checkpoint and your car is getting impounded, you can now call your family or friend to come and get your car. That's it. Very simple. But how it was done was an incredible movement success. The win came directly up from community priorities. The diversity of immigrant communities worked together. Northern, southern, inland, coastal in California worked together, and they successfully shaped the narratives on these checkpoints. And those are movement building metrics. And you know what? After getting a taste of this first victory, the group said, okay, what's next? What are we going to work on together next? They didn't go back to their corners and work independently. They wanted to take on the next successive challenge. And at that point, I knew we were on to something. So fast forward, that's exactly what they did. And now the California immigrant rights movement is strong, has put the concept of separating police and immigration enforcement on the national stage, has exported a bunch of very important policy reforms to separate public safety and police with immigration enforcement. And most importantly, the lives of immigrants in California have improved significantly. So today, over 100 pro-immigrant laws have passed in our state house since that modest DUI win. And over $500 million has been invested in immigrant communities. And more importantly, California is showing the country that embracing your immigrant communities results in a happy ending. Our kids are playing soccer together, and our economy and communities are stronger. So it's important sometimes to recognize that you have to start small and build from there. And I think our experience illustrates one of the lessons from the BHC report beautifully, which was the lesson that says, look, measure the growth of power building capacity over time. And when these building block pieces were coming together, the ability to shape a narrative, voter turnout increases, partnerships across the state, folks working across race lines, the younger undocumented dreamers working with their aunties and their grandmothers, I knew we were moving towards something more ambitious and more transformational. So let me end there and turn it back to you, Anand.
Thank you, Cathy. And Tony, I'd love to kind of get you involved in the conversation again. And there's so many parallels, which is exactly why we were so excited to have Cathy join us. Parallels between the work of Haas Jr. and other folks who are supporting community power and the experience of the California Endowment and building healthy communities. So would love for you to kind of share an example of kind of those same types of principles of investing for the long game, starting small, listening to communities. And I know that there are numerous examples of where you all or partners, I should say, have been in communities asking, what does a healthy community look like? And it's kind of led to some interesting ideas, and would just love to hear you, Tony, just kind of share some of the examples and help bring that to life from the VHC experience.
Yeah, and it was such a pleasure listening to Cathy. And it was bringing back the memories of being engaged in some of that work. And what she's describing is essentially increasing a sense of agency, power and control in a population that has essentially been marginalized. And we believe that sense of agency is critical to health. So what Cathy's describing is really a health initiative. My favorite story, and there's so many from building healthy communities, there are over 1,700 policy wins, systems changes, tangible benefits that we chronicled over the 10 years. comes out of the Central Valley, which is really kind of our most conservative region in the state, and the city of Fresno and Fresno County, and a group of community residents in Fresno who basically polled their community at the beginning of building healthy communities to try to understand what it was that people really saw, envisioned, as a healthy community. And one of the things that came up in a big way was parks and parkland, places, safe places for young people to play, during the summers and schools, places that were maintained and had facilities and opportunities for kids to develop their talents and their skills and their leadership and the like. And so the community set about working with the city to try to assess ways of growing park space in the southern part of Fresno. And one of the first things that they discovered when looking at the general plan in Fresno was that the parks master plan hadn't been updated for something like 20 years. And when they looked at the actual mapping of park space in Fresno, that there was 5 times as much park per capita in the northern part of the city, where it's wealthier and whiter, than in the southern part. And the quality of the parks in the southern part was very poor. They were poorly maintained. The bathrooms were just boarded up. The fields, the grasses were run raw. And so they started documenting this, and they created a campaign, which was called Parks for All. And one of the most incredible things that they did was that they took the actual metrics, the data from the general plan, this 5 times per capita park space in the north, and they made a bus banner of it. And they went to the Fresno Bus Company and said, we'd like to put this up on the buses. Well, the city said, no, we don't want any political messaging on our buses. And the community said, political? I mean, we literally took data from your own Parks Master Plan. And so it became a big fight. It got national press attention. And it ended up generating the kind of attention that they hadn't even anticipated, much more than they would have got from people just seeing it on the side of buses. And as a consequence, they recognized that they were onto something. They managed to get the city to commit to prioritizing South Fresno for some parks bond money. They went further. They gathered signatures for a political campaign, an initiative called Measure P. And they won. 51% of Fresno voters voted for Measure P, which would provide for some 20 years resources for parks and arts in Fresno. The city challenged it, said that they needed a 2/3 majority. So the Fresno Building Healthy Communities folks sued the city and won in the Supreme Court. So now they're looking at $2 billion plus over the pendency of Measure P for parks throughout Fresno, with an emphasis on South Fresno now that the master plan has been updated. So this was, this came from a group of largely undocumented people, or disproportionately undocumented Fresno residents who'd been excluded from decision-making forever in Fresno. And they organized through building healthy communities and created the political muscle to be able to challenge not only the city, the mayor, the police chief, the fire chief, the Chamber of Commerce, but to win in the Supreme Court these resources, which will have profound health improvement impacts on young people in South Fresno for generations to come. And they're not done yet. The city now consults with this group when making decisions about pursuing bonds and various other political decisions that the city is considering. So that to me is just such a heartening story coming out of one of the most conservative parts of California, as a result of the same fundamental strategy of recognizing that health is political, and building the political muscle of communities to hold systems accountable for equity is a health improvement strategy.
Thank you, Tony. And I want to give each of you, Cathy and Tony, a chance to share kind of reflections on the role of philanthropy in supporting this work, and what different roles that foundations can play, and then any closing thoughts that you want to offer. But before I do that, I just hope folks can understand, if you came here because you thought it was interesting conversation on health equity, they're certainly focused on that. If you came here because you were interested in democratic inclusion, civic participation, hopefully you got a taste of that, but also saw why we brought together these topics under this conversation of a new health equity narrative that maybe on the face of it don't seem like they're connected. But I really appreciate Tony and Cathy making those connections about why participation in our civic processes, in elections, in being active in a nonpartisan sense is really, really important for community and health well-being. And it's why I think there were so many connections between the experience of Haas Jr. and the experience of the California Endowment over the past 10 years and in the Building Healthy Communities initiative. So before we close out, I'd love to have you, Cathy, first just share kind of reflections on what's the role, how can foundations best support and share power with communities, and then any other kind of closing thoughts you want to offer before we end today.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. I would love to just challenge and suggest that funders learn and look for places where there's organic energy, where folks are already coming together, where folks are already interested, and build on that. And I have a phrase that I sometimes say internally, which is, you can't bring the community folks in, your partners in, too early. There's just no such thing. And so we call it co-design at Haas Jr. We often start with folks. When something is just a nub of an idea and we're brainstorming, we bring community leaders and partners in. And I'll just end with a brief thought about an example of that. I think after these very difficult years where we've had the health pandemic and the racism pandemic and all the isolation that we've all experienced, one out of all of this disruption, I think one hopeful thing for me is how at the beginning, a year and a half, 2 years ago, we would look at low wage workers who are ignored, neglected, unappreciated, and we've seen exploited. And we've seen the importance of low wage workers in our day-to-day lives in an incredibly profound way. And now they are being called essential workers. So to go from exploited, ignored, invisible to essential, and wait till Christmas happens, folks, when all those shipyards are full of pallets of toys that have not been emptied. We have the incredible opportunity to build on something organic that is happening in our society right now. And that profound shift in this moment of hardship, disruption, and challenge, to me, really shows if you can go from low wage worker to essential worker, we don't want to just go back to where we were 2 years ago. We can go to a new place that is way more bold, way more promising, and way better for everybody in our society. So I would just leave you with that. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Cathy. And Tony would love to give you the same opportunity to share some closing thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Anand. We spent $1.8 billion over the 10 years of building healthy communities, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's really a drop in the bucket compared to what government spends every day, allegedly trying to improve health and opportunity for all. So what did we learn for that money? Well, I like to boil it down. I'm a pretty simple-minded person. And I say that the key ingredients were A, B, C. And A stands for agency, which is really a sense of control and power at the individual, at the family, and at the community level, particularly at the community level. B stands for belonging, which I like to think of in some ways as the opposite of racism. It's a sense of being seen, being heard, having your story known in your community and being valued. And part of doing the work of creating belonging is addressing the historical narrative in this country, which is a narrative of exclusion, and it's a narrative of racialized apartheid. And we learned a very, very hard lesson in this work, and that is that you have to create the time and the space for people to be able to heal from the trauma and the injury of racism in order to move forward. And then the C of ABC is really about conditions, fundamental conditions of opportunity. And too much of the work that we see, particularly in the health space, is really about services, which are remedial and largely transactional. And what we've recognized, if you don't focus on those core conditions, and that's what Cathy was talking about with the immigrant rights issue, the conditions that people face when they interact with these critical systems, the criminal justice system, the health system, the land use system, the education system. If those systems are essentially traps that drive people off of high trajectories and trap them into these systems that kind of don't let go of them, then we have a real problem with health and equity. If those systems are instead springboards to opportunity, then we have an opportunity to facilitate people being able to participate in the 21st century economy. So we learned ABC. We'll continue over the next 10 years to invest in those core ingredients of equity. And we recognize that we still have a lot of learning to do, but California is really America's future. And we look forward to helping to build that future with Cathy and with other partners for the next decade and beyond.
Thank you so much, Tony. And if those of you who are tuned in want to keep learning, we have barely scratched the surface. There are so many reports and resources pulling lessons learned and showing the not always straight path that comes out so neatly in these types of conversations to where the California Endowment and the work of building healthy communities has ended up. So if you're interested in learning more about community power and what investments, what does that actually look like? How do foundations need to reorient themselves? What are some of the different roles foundations can play in partnering authentically with communities, helping to change narratives and realizing that they are but one of many, many different actors and players in an ecosystem? There are so many resources to check out. And we encourage you and hope we've piqued your interest. If you like today's conversation, 2 weeks from today, November 4th, same time, same channel, we have another Leap Pad with Dr. Robert Ross, the president of the California Endowment, in conversation with Carla Ortiz and Christopher Covington, a past and a current member of the President's Youth Council, talking about some of the work that TCE has done to share and embrace youth power. So we hope you'll tune in for that. But really just want to thank Cathy for sharing her experience and the work of Haas Jr. Want to thank Tony for sharing some of his reflections from the work of the California Endowment. Would be remiss not to mention that we're talking about the roles of foundations, but this is the work of literally thousands of people across California in communities who have been advocating, organizing, sharing their stories, and certainly don't want that to be lost. None of this would be possible without that. And last of all, I want to thank all of you for tuning in and your interest in thinking about learning, equity, and power. And with that, thanks again for your time. Thanks to our guests, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.